So I'm a plotter, and every single time I sit down to outline a book, I always start with the same 5 plot points. I like to use these plot points because they establish a very clear framework for what this book is going to be, and it lets me get a good bird's eye view of the general structure of my book. In this video, I'm going to share with you what these 5 plot points are, but by the time that I use these 5 plot points, I have already figured out what my general story premise is, so essentially who my main character is, what they want, and what my antagonistic force is, like what my one sentence pitch would be for that book. Because if I don't have this figured out, then it's not very helpful to go and try to figure out the plot points. I need to know the general sketch of what this story is about before I go and try to figure out what these plot points are. If you're confused about what a main character or a protagonist is, or what an antagonist or antagonistic force is, or even what a one-sentence pitch typically looks like, drop a comment down below and I'd be super happy to answer that. Or I recommend going and watching other videos on my channel because I've made separate videos on these topics, and that will give you a better idea as to what the kind of things you need to figure out are before you get started writing a book. So if you've been subscribed to my channel for a while, you will know that I'm a huge fan of the story arc. Story arcs typically take this shape. They are plotted on a time and conflict kind of graph and look kind of like this. As time goes on, the conflict gets higher until it reaches a climax and ultimately resolves itself. Each of my 5 plot points can fit very nicely on this story arc, and I like to envision stories like this because that's generally the structure that I like to follow in writing. I want to have a tension that gets progressively higher as my story goes on, and that ultimately comes to a head and then resolves itself in some very satisfying way. These 5 plot points I don't really figure out in order, so I'm going to talk to you about them in the order that I like to figure them out in instead of the order in which they come over the course of the story. The first plot point I like to figure out is the inciting incident. This is the point in the story where the conflict really starts. It's also known as the call to adventure. It's the point that plucks your character out of their ordinary world and thrusts them into the adventure. So if your story is about a teenager who hears about some gold that's like buried, hidden somewhere in their town, and they set off to go try to find the hidden gold, the inciting incident would be about them learning about the gold hidden in their town. Or if they already knew about the gold in their town, it would be the moment that they actually embark to go try to find it. It's the point at which something happens to break your character out of their daily routine and where they encounter the conflict for the first time. So again, if your conflict is the fact that there's some hidden gold, your antagonist will probably be someone else who wants to go also find the gold in the town at the expense of the hero. And so the hero, it's going to be their first brush with the gold or like the news that the gold exists, but not necessarily the antagonist. They don't typically brush with the antagonist until later on in the story. But at this point that I'm outlining the book, I typically have an idea as to who the character is and what the general like premise and conflict is. So I decide to figure out what the point will be to have this character enter into the world. I find this the easiest plot point to start with because it also helps me figure out how I'm going to enter the world. Once I figure this out, I go back and I figure out the point of entry, which is the very first moment of your novel. Your point of entry is pretty much what it sounds like. It's the reader's point of entry into your novel and the very first moment that introduces your readers to your main character. I like to be very careful with my points of entry and think about how I can design the point to give the readers a very clear snapshot of who my main character is. Like the point of entry is the first impression. And if the reader only reads a page of my book, I want them to right off the bat know exactly who my main character is and already be able to get a sense for who they are before that page is even over. So this involves the character doing something that is very important to them, doing something that represents them in some way, having some sort of reaction to something, and whatever it reveals about the character has to be important. It can't just be this character like eating an entire brick of cheese for no reason and you just kind of show that they like cheese, but your story is actually like a hardcore serial killer thriller. The cheese thing probably won't be relevant unless you have a serial killer that's also really into cheese and somehow like forces his victims to all eat cheese until they die, and like then that might be important. But unless you're writing about the cheese killer, it's probably not super important. But if you are writing a serial killer thriller and your main character has to be resourceful because they're going to be able to escape or stop the serial killer in some way, you want to choose a moment that shows them being resourceful or shows them displaying that trait you want them to have. The best point of entries can both introduce you to the character and also set the tone for the story. You want the first half a page of your book to also capture what kind of book it is. Like if you are writing a serial killer thriller, having that character do something kind of dark, or have like the tone be dark and gritty, or have them escaping something or running away from something, or, you know, they're on the subway and a guy says something really creepy and it gives them an unsettling feeling, but then they have a really quick, smart response to it and a way to escape that situation, that would both show that they're resourceful and also set the tone that this might be a scarier book. The next point I like to figure out after that is the climax. So I'm really skipping ahead here, like pretty much from beginning to end, but the climax is the part in your story where the conflict comes to a head. This is the final battle. This is the all or nothing race for the gold, where the character finds the gold and loses the gold, then gets the gold again. It's the point where the serial killer has abducted the main character and the main character has to escape them. It's the biggest moment of your book, like the thing that you've been building towards for the entire book. I like to figure this out really early because this tells me what my book is about. Sometimes I'll try to do too much, or I'll have so many different ideas for a story, but they can't all fit into the climax, and so figuring out what the climax is and boiling the book down to what the climax is helps me really figure out what it is that I'm writing. And it also gives me an idea of where I'm supposed to be going. So when I go back and try to outline the book and flesh out the stuff like between the inciting incident and the climax, I will know where I'm going. And so it's easier for me to figure out like what point A is and what point B is, so I can figure out how to get my characters from point A to point B. It's a lot harder to figure out what point A is and not know where I'm going and try to figure out where I'm going along the way. That's just not how my brain works, and that's not how I write. But other people do write like that and can write very well like that. So this is only what works for me, and if your brain works better not knowing what point B is, then completely ignore everything I've told you in this video and just go do you. Once I've figured out the climax, I then like to go backwards again and figure out the midpoint. The midpoint is the middle point in your novel that should act as a turning point for your book. The way I like to think about the midpoint is that there are two halves to the book. So there's the pre-midpoint and the post-midpoint. And in the first half of your book, everything building up to the midpoint, your reader should think your book is a particular thing. Like they should think that it's like I don't know, if you're writing a mystery, they think it's a standard murder mystery where, you know, they're trying to figure out who the killer is, or they're trying to solve the crime along with a detective. But then something crazy happens halfway through the book that flips the narrative on its head and makes the entire second half of the book something completely different. One of my favorite midpoints is the midpoint from the movie Knives Out that follows kind of a similar premise to the one that I just said. Like the first half of the book, you think that it's a murder mystery and you think that you're trying to solve the crime with the detectives, but then the midpoint happens, you actually figure out what happened to the person, you figure out who killed the person, but you really like the person who accidentally killed the person, and then the rest of the movie becomes whether or not this person is going to be able to get away with what they did. And you're really rooting for them to get away with what they did because you like them. And so it flips the trope on its head and it makes the first half and the second half of the movie completely different. Now, not all midpoints are going to be this dramatic, but every single book, in my opinion, should have some sort of midpoint twist. At least every single genre book. Like, I'm not really talking, I don't talk about literary fiction on this channel. I talk about genre fiction because that's what I write. I write genre fiction that is meant to be commercial and easy to read and pleasurable to read. It's not necessarily meant to be very artsy. And so I focus hard on storytelling conventions that help deliver reader expectations, subconscious reader expectations, and also pleasure to my readers. So a lot of the advice that I give on this channel is really geared towards commercial fiction. So if you write literary fiction, just keep that in mind. But I really think that all compelling stories should have a midpoint twist. This can look also like if you're writing a serial killer thriller, the first half is you trying to solve the mystery of the serial killer, and then the second half is you trying to survive because the serial killer is now targeting you. That's why a lot of movies typically do that, because it changes the stakes and does some sort of twist in the middle. Or you can have a midpoint twist that raises the stakes in some really dramatic way, that changes the action in some way. Like maybe they're trying to stop the bad guy using very conventional methods, and then halfway through they decide to try something absolutely crazy that just makes the whole second half of the book just like completely insane. But I like to figure out what this is going to be pretty early so that I can get a big picture idea of what sorts of scenes that I should put in the first half and the second half of the book, and like how both of those can work and operate differently from each other. A lot of the time, this involves just a lot of brainstorming and putting in placeholders and things before I really figure out what the best midpoint is going to be. But I like having just a general idea. Like I'll do a big brainstorm and I'll try to come up with the craziest midpoint that I can and find one that really fits with what I want the book to be, and then build out from there. And maybe as I'm fleshing it out, almost guaranteed actually, I will think of something better and then go back and outline that and play with it more until it all holds together. And finally, the fifth plot point that I like to figure out is the resolution. This happens after the climax and is what it sounds like. It's just the point that everything resolves and how the book ends. Like, do the characters live happily ever after? Does it push into a sequel? How do the characters continue on after the climax? And how do you want to set it up for a potential sequel if you wanted to do that? Or how are you going to make sure that your ending is satisfying to your reader? I usually write books in series, but I've also written standalones, and having an idea of how the characters are going to end up and where they're going to end up helps me figure out kind of the end of their character arc and how I want them to change from beginning to end, because the characters are going to be very different by the end of the book than they will be at the beginning of the book if you've done your job right, and if that's what you choose to do, write characters that change. I don't really like writing cliffhanger endings. I used to do that, but I'm not a huge fan of that anymore, and I made a video as to why. That I can link in the description of this video if you want to go learn more about my thoughts on cliffhangers. But everything that I'm putting under these 5 plot points at this stage in my writing process is all just penciled in. I don't write in pen, I write like in whiteboard dry erase markers, because I'm constantly moving things around at this stage and thinking of better ways to do things and more interesting ways to do things. Nothing is set in stone. And it's all a very organic brainstorm process. I'm just putting things on paper to see how I feel about them. And once I have 5 plot points that I kind of like and I'm feeling are okay, then I will go in and start trying to come up with scenes to fill in the gaps and get characters between each of these 5 plot points. What I like to do is I have this big whiteboard and I will write each of these plot points down. I'll draw out the story arc, write each plot point on the story arc, and then I'll take post-it notes and physically stick them on the story arc until I can kind of envision what the story is going to look like. And as I allow myself to brainstorm, I will often think of better midpoints, more interesting ways to do things, and change those plot points around. But these are the 5 plot points that I start with because it offers enough structure for me to be able to see the book from the big picture, but not too much structure that it's overwhelming. So that's all I got for this video on the 5 plot points that I like to start with when outlining. I hope that it was helpful. If you have a second, I'd be super grateful if you could like this video and also subscribe to my channel. My name is Fraise, and I'm an award-winning author who makes videos sharing actionable writing tips that helped me make my own writing better. I'm the author of the 5-book paranormal thriller They Stay series, along with my debut novel that I published in high school. I have a couple of books next year that are coming out that I'm very excited about, and I am in the process of sketching out rough outlines for some of the books that I want to be writing this year, and that's kind of what inspired me to come make this video. Do you also like to outline your books? If you do you like to outline more than I do or less than I do? Do you have plot points that you like to figure out before you start writing that really help you? If so, let me know down in the comments below. I would super appreciate hearing from you, and I'm sure other people in the community would too. I hope you have a fantastic week, everybody, and as always, happy writing.